Hello, everyone. Today is Saturday, February 29th, 2020. I'm Bob Diebold, Vice Chairman of the Committee for the Global Endeavor. Today, we continue with Phase 6 and the 33rd webinar in our series of webinars on the topic, Comparing and Contrasting the True Teachings of Jesus with the Traditional Tenets and Practices of Organized Institutional Christianity. This is topic 8 in the study guide called Revelation Revealed. Neil Waldrop is the author and also the chairman of the committee. I'm turning this webinar over to him right now. Neil, over to you.
Thank you, Bob. As you stated, we are having our webinar today on the 29th of February, an opportunity that arises only once every 4 years, but I assure you we will not wait 4 years for the next webinar. In any case, as Bob stated, the topic pertains to comparing the practices of organized institutional Christianity with the true teachings of Jesus. We have been at this for quite a while. We will continue. For those of you who may not have been following our series, I would recommend that you make available to yourself the underlying documents on which our series is based. This basically consists of two documents at present: the original text, Revelation Revealed, that I wrote in mid-2016, and a recent supplement, Living the Real Religion of Jesus, that I wrote in June 2019, June of last year. Both of these documents are available for you to download from the website of the Committee for the Global Endeavor. The citation is as follows: www.globalendeavor.net. I say again, www.globalendeavor.net. In this citation, Global Endeavor is treated as a single word without any space or punctuation in the middle. The links to download these two documents, Revelation Revealed and Living the Real Religion of Jesus, are about 2/3 of the way down the homepage of the website that I gave you. Now, because you will have no opportunity to ask us questions as we go along, we offer you the option, if you wish, of sending us in a question or two by email. If you decide to do that, you would use the email address that is listed at the bottom of the homepage of the website I gave you, namely info@globalendeavor.net. If we decide to use your question, we reserve the right to edit the wording. And in that event, you would get an answer from the entire panel of participants, not just from me personally. So now, having finished the preliminary procedural explanation, I will turn to the substance of our discussion today. Specifically, we are focusing on page 11 of my document, Living the Real Religion of Jesus. At this point, we are coming close to the end of discussing a subtopic in that document called the presence of God. We previously discussed aspects of this question, starting with immanence and transcendence. We then proceeded to discuss aspects of God the sevenfold, including the work of our Creator Son and his partner, the creative Mother Spirit. We then proceeded to talk about God the Supreme, both the Supreme Being and to some degree the Almighty Supreme. And we have most recently begun talking about God's plans for the improvement and upgrade of our planet as a whole, as implemented partly through the work of the Master Seraphim. The series of questions that we will ask and answer today are predicated on ideas contained in this segment of my essay, and they are intended to be challenging. We began last week with preliminary discussion of question E on page 11, but certainly did not finish, and several people present today did not have the opportunity to give you their views on that question. So this is where we will resume. I will proceed to read the question and will then call on each of our friendly volunteers to give his or her impression. The question reads as follows. E, please explain and interpret the idea of eventually discovering God in all the creatures and creations of a mighty universe. How do you associate this potential discovery with each of the three persons of the Paradise Trinity? To what degree would it also relate to the roles of God the Supreme Being, the ongoing active efforts of God the Sevenfold, or both? Well, Marvin, you were on vacation last week. I knew you were engaged in laudable family matters, but you have had a rest. And so now I would like to put you to work. Would you be the first person to answer the question today?
Yes, Neil, thank you. I will do my best. It's a complex question. I'm going to kind of look at it again here. Eventually discovering God in all the creatures and creations of a mighty universe. How do you associate this potential discovery with each of the three persons of the Paradise Trinity and God the Supreme and God the Sevenfold? I think I'll try and approach this from the avenue of the God the Supreme. Because God the Sevenfold is God as God operates on multiple levels in the universe, in the emerging reality experientially of the Supreme, or God the Supreme. So in a sense, the whole of it is God the Supreme. And the Trinity, I mean, the Father is, I guess for me, I always try and bring it down on some level to my personal experience. What am I experiencing? What are we experiencing? And the Father participates with each of us as the indwelling thought adjuster, the indwelling Spirit of God. So this experiential unfolding that's happening in the Supreme is happening on multiple levels all at once. It's happening in our intimate interior personal relationship with God. It's happening amongst each other. This conversation is part of the emerging reality of the Supreme. And it's all experiential. We're experiencing our conversation. We're each experiencing, with varying degrees of awareness, the presence of God within and are sharing with God's presence within, right in this moment. And all of the implications of that interior sharing and our sharing amongst each other in relationships, it constitutes the emerging reality of the Supreme, and it's happening on a universe stage that is the material universe, which is the almighty Supreme part of it. So it's all, I think I used the metaphor a couple of weeks ago of a stage play. And there are the players, there's the plot, there's the stage itself with all the props, and it's all unfolding in real time. And that is the adventure of God during this universe age of the stage, the play is unfolding, and we are part of it. So just going back to your question, you're focusing on the idea of eventually discovering God in all the creatures and creations of a mighty universe. And so for me, on all these different levels, there is this experience of discovery of our contacting with God, unfolding in reality on all these levels, inwardly, exteriorly. And we get to participate in it. We get to experience some small slice of it, as if we were one of the actors on the stage, right? We experience the other actors, we experience the play itself, the stage, the audience, everyone, everything as part of the Supreme. So it is a mutual discovery process, and it's not predetermined. We each get to make our contributions, and it is a live unfolding experiment and an adventure that God and the gods, the Trinity, have set in motion. And we get to be part of it, and we get to contribute to it, and we get to be thrilled by the discovery of it individually and with each other. So really quite a profound process of encounter and engagement and involvement. And it's the opposite of dull and boring. It's just exciting, it's thrilling, and it's happening all around us, and we are part of it. So just so for whatever that's worth, opening thoughts, Neil.
Well, thank you, Marvin, for launching us today. It was very interesting, as you always are. I will now turn to Francois, and I will tell him that even though Marvin has stated that the question itself is already complex, I am going to add to your complexities, Francois. And this is because, by implication, the question is a strong contrast to the theories and philosophy of deism that became prominent in the 18th century. I will paraphrase them very briefly as the idea that God created the world and then he went out to lunch. So we know that's not true. We know that God is actively engaged in the world, actively engaged in the universe. And the question here is how our discovery of his activities and participation relates to each of these broad features of deity that we can perceive, to which we can relate, whose presence we can sense. So it's now for you, Francois. You have to unmute yourself, excuse me.
It's better this way.
Well, we'd like to hear you instead of having you just mumble in silence.
I didn't want to make mistakes when speaking, so with the sound off, there was no problem. No, it's really a good question, and I like what Marvin says. And but the first place that we have to, and it's a work in progress, but the first place that we're gonna find God is in oneself. It's progressive, and when you feel that you can recognize it, discovering God is being conscious. So when you come conscious of his presence, you start to see him in others too. So the first place where we can discover God is in our fellows human, and in the nature too, with the creatures and creations. So there's a place for the Almighty Supreme with the creations that are not personal too. But we can see a lot. It's like to find God, it needs an effort. You can't find God. It's not just put the switch on and God is there. It's a very, it needs efforts, and it's not innate or natural. Okay, I compare this to scuba diving. Okay, you can't live underwater, but with special devices, you can go and find out the corals and the fish and everything, but you need something special. It's the same thing to discover because if we refer to your previous excerpt in the page 10, when you once begin to find God in your soul, not in your mind, in your soul. So we can see easily the soul. So we need a special device to connect with the soul, and eventually we find God, and about the same time discover another man's soul, and eventually, so after sometimes after, in all the creatures and creations of a mighty universe. So we're limited here, but after we'll see a lot of people, of creatures. There's not the same that we are, and for the role with the Supreme, you talk about in your question with the Paradise Trinity. Everybody that we're gonna meet in the universe, there's offsprings of 1, 2, or 3 persons of the Trinity. So our seraphim helpers, there's from the creative spirit, and we are connected to, after discovering the Father with the thought adjuster, and our mind is connected with the spirit and everything that, but we'll start to know a lot of people that are 1, 2, or 3 persons of the Trinity, and even the Trinitarians at the end with the days, the ancient of days, and something like that. But what can I do? The rest of the question is God the sevenfold and the supreme. So it bring me to see what is God the sevenfold, and I check this, and there's sevenfold, but there's 6 person that we're not there, but there's one that we are a part of, and it's the supreme being. So we're part of God the sevenfold with our thought adjuster, and if eventually we continue life after that, we will be part of the supreme, the soul part of God the sevenfold. But it's the only part that is in progress. And so we participate in that, and so our discover is bigger and bigger. And
Thank you. I would ask you to comment on the fact that part of God the sevenfold is our creator son, Michael,
yes,
and the creative mother spirit. So we certainly benefit from their efforts, and they are part of this overall presence of God that we are commenting on. I assume you agree with that. I see
yes,
you nodding. Yes.
absolutely, yes.
Okay. Dorian, I'm going to give you yet another variation on the question. You have commented on many occasions on meeting people in day-to-day life who may ask you a question or perhaps just show a receptivity, and that it was certainly possible for you to infer that God was present in them and around them. I would like to turn this upside down and ask you about perhaps encountering people who seem thoroughly negative, unreceptive to positive ideas, perhaps criminal, perhaps aggressive, perhaps violent. Now, without judging them morally, I would like you to address the question as to whether this behavior of theirs results from some possibility whereby God is not present, or is it a result of something else that you might be able to describe for us?
Well, first of all, you can only see God with the soul, not with my material mind. So that's irrelevant. But I don't know if I told you the story about, I was on the train with these 3 guys that looked like criminals a couple of weeks ago. And everybody, they happened to come from the Middle East, and one was sitting next to me, the other 2 were standing in front of me, but everybody was staring at them very nervously. And I said to myself, you know what, I'm gonna stop this, because we're judging people just by their, facade and not knowing them. So I said, excuse me, I said, what language are you speaking? And they said Arabic. And I said, oh, how interesting. And from which country? And they said Egypt. Egypt, well, I was in Egypt. And we went on to talk about Egypt and the experiences. It happened that they were pilots coming from Egypt here for the weekend and putting up, they're put up in a hotel and they're just touring the city. So when I started talking, they were laughing, and I was telling them all kinds of stories that I had when I was there. You see the looks on other people and how it changed. And that to me is, an opportunity to turn things around. But I wanted to answer the question that you asked in E, just a little bit, and I'll be brief because I don't want to repeat what everyone else said. But, you know, I figured, look, we're time creatures. We progress in experience and maturity, you know, as we ascend, correct? So we fuse with the thought adjuster. And when we do that, it gives us a past eternity and an experience, you know, and a memory. So the quality for eternity probably comes a part of our consciousness. So because you're asking, how do we recognize all these levels, you know, of deity? So there's the emerging, of course, with finite growth, you know, you have the emerging supreme now, which everybody said, we'll welcome that, and that'll come to an end. But everything is a synthesis, of course, of growth and power and personality. But what I found in the book, and I thought here is maybe what you're looking for, it said we have a type of personality that has the seventh and supreme dimension. It's called associable absolute. It's not infinite. It has capacity to penetrate the absolute level in the sub-absolute sense. So we have a potential destiny that is absolute in value. We will always be able to make progress in the universe, meanings and values on those absolute levels because of the gift of the thought adjuster. So, you know, and this, just to finalize it, it says, you know, we're all in the process of growth and the destiny is perfection all around. So that's how I understand we could recognize with the thought adjuster's help.
Thank you very much. I will now turn to Bob, once again, our cleanup hitter here, and give him yet another variation of the ideas contained in the question. I previously mentioned the concept of deism, whereby that theory was that God was disconnected. I think the question also, by implication, covers the fact that there really is not a separation or a firm distinction that divides matter from spirit, that matter, mind, and spirit are part of a threefold arrangement of finite reality that we all benefit from, and that matter too is a product of God's creation. Specifically, the Almighty Supreme is the element of the Supreme Being that correlates with matter. And so the question here of discovering God in all the creatures and creations of a mighty universe implicitly involves agreeing that there is a unity of finite reality that encompasses matter as well as mind and spirit. And how do we discover this fact that God's plans encompass matter as well as mind and spirit? That at least is part of the question that is now lying before you, Bob.
So you've added the question of how do we discover this triunity of matter, mind, and spirit, which will be summated, superadditive in the Supreme, of course. And do you still want me to go back to discuss, because I think I'll have to do that, is to talk a little bit about the Trinity, and maybe this is a time to expand upon that, because I think that's where we have to almost start and move to, or I should say, move back to understand how, you know, why are all three aspects of reality, matter, mind, and spirit, something that has to be coordinated and resolved through personality. So
well, you've given yourself a series of options, and I accept all of them. What I was doing in mentioning the three elements, matter, mind, and spirit, was to paraphrase the word creations that is in the second line of the question. But you are free to go at this however you want, and I certainly would like to hear your views on how we see the three persons of the Paradise Trinity reflected and present.
Okay, so let me start with the Trinity. and I think you gave me the into that when you were talking about the unity of a deity. So I'm going to go back to the beginning, God's escape from infinity, and kind of explain that just a little bit, or not actually explain it, but to provide what I know about it. And it's mostly from paper 105. This idea of a trinity makes seems to make things complex, but if we look at the way that that particular paper discusses the I am's escape from infinity, because that was always something that we really never had a good handle on. So here's the picture that I have. And this is all without beginning. So if I use the word beginning, I've got to apply my time-oriented finite mind to do this. It's a sequence of events that the papers give us as a philosophical concession, as they do with the I am. So we're taught that the I am is a total reality. It's both potential and actual, and it's infinity with will always applied to it, wrapped in the infinitude. So those terms are trying to give us the impression that we're really talking about something that's so big that it's almost impossible for the human mind to conceive. But that's the way that it's been described, and I think it puts a pretty big term on it. Well, how does the I am / the Father Infinite escape from this what they call the fetters of infinity? If there is a time, and in fact there is not a time, so there's the paradox, when free will has to be applied so that the I am separated into deity and non-deity. And then if we take the deity part, so we can get to the Trinity, let's leave the non-deity part aside just for a second, because that's going to be the potential that the universe will use to create more energy and such. The deity part, then we then get the 7 absolutes of infinity, the eternal Son, and then the infinite Spirit, which at the same moment then ejects paradise. There's the matter, mind, and spirit in the existential Trinity, not the original I am, but the existential 3 absolutes of infinity that are the actual part. The 3 potential 7 absolutes, the 3 of the absolutes which are potential, I'll just leave out for a second. That's the deity absolute, the unqualified, the qualified absolute, and the universal absolute. We'll just leave those there for a second. So as the Father created these 2 personalities, the eternal Son, which then made him a father, the infinite Spirit, and paradise, which is the energy and matter part, there was still total reality that was still existent. And this is the part that took me a long time to try to understand why the Trinity. And if the I am was total reality in the beginning, and the I am separated and created himself a father of the eternal Son, and if he and the eternal Son then created the infinite Spirit as well as paradise, then what we have is an association, and that's the associative part of perfection. So why the Trinity? There's still total reality. So total reality is the Trinity. It still exists. And the way that the papers explain this to us is that how we as finite thinking humans ought to think about the Trinity is not as an individual association. Yes, there's 3 personalities, the Father Infinite, the Eternal Son, and the Infinite Spirit. But they operate as a corporation. And the way to think of this corporation, taking this from Bill Sadler Jr., who had spent quite a bit of time thinking about this and wrote a couple of books about it, is that it's not a partnership. And in fact, the papers talk about that a couple of times. I've got a couple of paragraphs that would explain that. So total deity, total reality is unity. So out of this threeness, I'm sorry, let me start with this. Out of oneness, the I am, becomes threeness, becomes the seven absolutes of infinity. So our Trinity is total reality. And as we move out into the grand universe, at the same time as the paradise was ejected and created, Havona is also eternal, and that's the perfect reflection of paradise. So why is there a Trinity? There's many reasons, and one of the statements in the papers is that, well, it's for association, but it's described to us as a corporation. So the three infinite personalities, the Father, the Eternal Son, and the Infinite Spirit, we could think of them as the board of directors. Every time they act, there's an action on total reality, and that connects us to the Supreme. All of reality involves matter, paradise, spirit, the Eternal Son, mind, the Infinite Spirit, and the Father, who then upholds all of it and provides personality and fragments of himself, which is the thought adjuster. Of course, we've spoken about this before, that the Father only delegates, doesn't delegate just the thought adjuster and personality. So it's personality that has to weave and create the power of personality elements, the experience, both in finite, ultimate, and as Doreen brought up, the sub-infinite penetration of the absolute. Someone in our reading group over the years, as we started to study these particular ideas, which are a little bit more advanced, of course, said a very interesting statement. It said, it almost appears as though that the I am is trying to create an experiential clone of himself. Not a bad thought to have, to be honest with you. And I've thought about that over the years, that's essentially what is going on in the grand and master universe, is that everything is experiential until we reach, as Doreen brought up, a penetration of the absolute. So we're starting with all of reality, and we're going to recreate, appears to be all of infinity, but just a sub-infinite penetration of that. Not, it probably never ends. So how do I associate? So I guess the question then, I took the middle part of that question, how do I associate this potential discovery with each of the three persons of the Paradise Trinity? Well, it's a Paradise Trinity that are responsible for all of total reality. And it's that total reality that is then being experiential. Now, going back to the first part of that question, please explain and interpret the idea of eventually discovering God in all of the creatures and creations. Well, that's what's going on. We're going to go through the grand universe education system after we leave the local universe of Nebadon. We're going to meet personalities that have never been revealed to us even here, and they've definitely revealed quite a few of them. One of them comes in mind here. I mean, how are we actually going to feel the presence of God? The primary question, with those personalities who don't have thought adjusters. I think I'll just leave that on the table right now, because that's what our education will be. Humans will have the thought adjusters with the factual presence of the Father, where the descending celestial agents will not. When we reach and we go to the Univitation, for example, which is in the constellation, and we go through that, I think from what the papers tell us is this is a real challenge. We have to live with 10 Univitation. I think that might be why Urantia is a unique place, because we have some experience with a cacophony of personalities that maybe some of these other planets who have not had rebellion and default don't have the opportunity to really experience. So we may have some opportunities, if we can take that learning with us, to be able to function well in the grand universe as we ascend to paradise. Over.
All right, thank you. I would start off by remarking that your most recent comments, it seems to me, paraphrase the idea of an agandanter, that people who ascend from worlds that are troubled have a unique ability to believe without seeing, to have faith, and so on, so that benefits
Great
us
point.
in the long run. Now,
Yeah.
I'm obliged to go a little bit back into your analysis of the relationship of the I am with the persons of the Trinity and so on, in the sense of pointing out, as you will undoubtedly agree, that the instructions, that the concept of the I am is a human explanation keyed to the capabilities of finite minds who are operating in time and space. And so we have an issue with even the word simultaneous, because the word simultaneous comes from two words in Latin, which mean at the same, and then time. But if we're talking about events that do not occur in time, then how can they be simultaneous? They cannot be. And so the sequence of events that you've explained inevitably involved events that succeeded each other, but that is only a convenience for our finite understanding. Whereas the revelators tell us unequivocally that the Father, the Son, and the Spirit are co-eternal, coexistent, infinite, always were. So we have deep paradoxes here that have to do with trying to explain these matters from a finite perspective, namely beings who live in time and space. We are stuck with time, and that is the best we can do. But this is the conceptual explanation that the revelators have provided while telling us that it is a conceptual explanation keyed to our situation as finite beings in time and space. Marvin has volunteered to add additional elements on this general topic. I suppose it is because he feels energized by his vacation for a week that he wants to come in for a second chance at this question. And so I now recognize him.
Thanks, Neil. I'm stimulated by everything everyone has shared. So thank you. And I wanted to go back to one of the questions you posed, Neil, and that is related to deism, which posits the idea that God set everything in motion and then went away. I think you said when it took off and went to lunch, which is a nice
humorous way of saying it. Yes.
Yes, nice colloquial way to say it. And I wanted to kind of respond to that. So, you're asking, well, which is it? Is God still here or is God gone? And the whole thing is kind of unfolding on its own according to plan. What's interesting to me is when I step back, take a giant step back and look at the theology that is described in the Urantia book. A couple of things pop out to me. Many things pop out, but a couple of things in particular in relation to this conversation. The Urantia book, this theology, describes God as being initially in a state before manifestation, before God manifested in any way. And they use the term existential, which is the I am. Before God did anything and any creation resulted, the I am existed as the pure state of existential potential out of which anything could flow, right? And it had volition. It had the ability to intend something, God, as I am, did, and make it happen. So then God began to use that volition and began to initiate realities and began to manifest, right? Move from a state of before manifesting to a state of beginning to manifest, to make things happen. And the theology of the Urantia book is interesting in the sense that it says that God is absolutely unified and one, and yet God manifests as God in many, many different ways throughout creation. And that is characteristic of the plan that the I am set into motion as the I am began to manifest in reality. And so they're saying that God began to function as the Father of the Son, and together they began to function as the co-creators of the Spirit, and that these are simultaneous. They're not time reactions. They're sequential. One comes out of the other, but without time. So go figure that part of it. So God, in answer to your question, is God here or is God out to lunch? Yes and yes, and yes and yes and yes and yes, right? God is both removed and still the I am on some level, right? Before manifestation, because God can do that. And God is manifesting in many different ways as discrete beings, and yet somehow is unified and singular. And God can do that. God is the creator sons and the creative spirits on all the local universes in the sevenfold, and the ancients of days and the master spirits in the sevenfold. It's all God. It's all working. It's all engaged in the creation. God exists within each one of us as the divine adjuster indwelling fragment. That's God too, manifesting in an additional way. So God is both separate and transcendent and the other in the most absolute ways. And God is both immanent all around us and within us. God is in the person of the infinite spirit, the matter of the universe, and in paradise, the matter of the universe. The energy in the infinite spirit and the matter of the universe, and modeled in paradise and unfolding in the super universes of time and space. God is all of it, both manifest and unmanifested, and much beyond that. And what's happening is God willed that every volitional creature, every one of us, and every one of the created beings in the universe get to encounter and be involved in different elements of that creation and different manifestations of God. We get to encounter that and be in relationship with God in all of these different ways, and with the whole of the creations of time and space in the Supreme, and in many, many diverse ways. And we get to do that unfolding through time in space in an eternal ascent toward God's presence on paradise, actual presence. So is God out to lunch, or is God on the stage of the play? Is God the props on the stage? Is God the actors? Is God the director? Is God the audience? God, yes, 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 and yes, and yes. God is all of those things. And we are part of all the encounter of all of those things. And we have an eternal destiny in which to encounter all of those varying manifestations of God, including coming into the immediate presence of the infinite spirit, the eternal Son, and the universal Father, one by one, in quote sequence, as we ascend, and coming to know them in some fashion, and coming to merge with the Supreme in some fashion. So we have a remarkable adventure ahead of us of discovering the various manifestations of God in an endless adventure. So it's a very interesting question you're asking, questions you're raising.
Thank you, Marvin. I believe that your repeated use of yes, 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 and yes largely establishes that you agree with the premise of the first sentence of my question, that God is present in all the creatures and creations of a mighty universe. He is present, not absent, and he is certainly not out to lunch in the colloquial sense that I mentioned before.
And we can discover those various manifestations of presence as well.
Well, Bob has just signified that he's jealous that you've had a second turn, so Bob wants one also.
Yeah, it always stimulates some thought, especially when these webinars get going. Just wanted to follow up. Yeah, I think that's a really good way to talk about how to resolve a paradox, Marvin, is to say that both solutions are correct. I mean, if you think about what we talked about with transcendence and immanence as being a paradox, we see these many paradoxes, and both are both are right. The story of the life carriers resolves the paradox of creation versus uh, intelligent creation. But I thought I would just read from paper 10, section 7, paragraph 2 to support what you just said about this yes, yes. Not exactly, but this is what caught my mind. And it says, as things appear to the mortal on the finite level, the paradise trinity, like the supreme being, is concerned only with the total planet, total universe, total super universe, total grand universe. This totality attitude exists because the Trinity is the total of deity and for many other reasons. As you were saying, there's many other reasons as to what, why we're saying yes, yes to both of those things. The Father delegates almost everything except, as I mentioned, just the thought adjuster, personality, and of course, he's at the center and upholding the universe of universes. So we can't resolve these paradoxes here today, but they are paradoxes and they are resolvable. And that's why we need to continually think about these things and reflect on them, because they pose such large concepts for us to resolve at some point. Over.
Thank you for interpreting the word paradox. I had a rather playful definition from a friend. He said that a paradox can be understood as a primary care physician consulting a specialist, and therefore a paradox.
Very good.
Francois is groaning here. I can understand why, because that's his profession. In any event, I
just briefly, Neil,
yes,
just to say, tag on to what Bob said. These things are paradox only because we are time-space creatures in a time-space context. In eternity and ultimately, they're not paradoxical. And part of our journey of discovery is discovery out of the apparent paradox into the reality that is unifying. Yeah.
Well, you're quite right, Marvin. And I would simply supplement what you've just said, that by description of the revelators, our progression through the mansion worlds on up, all the way to paradise, is also a progression of mind and understanding. We will eventually have a spirit mind, not a finite mind of the type we have now. And in those circumstances, many fewer items will seem paradoxical, although there will still be certain mysteries of the infinity of God that we will not be able to comprehend. But in any event, there will be many fewer paradoxes at that time when we have reached the spirit level in our long journey of ascent. So I would now like to turn to the next question in the sequence at the top of page 11, question F. But before I do that, and I think as a useful background, I will reread the second paragraph of the excerpt from Jesus' second discourse on religion that appears on page 10 of my essay, the preceding page. And it reads as follows: when you once begin to find God in your soul, presently you will begin to discover him in other men's souls, and eventually in all the creatures and creations of a mighty universe. But what chance does the Father have to appear as a God of supreme loyalties and divine ideals in the souls of men who give little or no time to the thoughtful contemplation of such eternal realities? While the mind is not the seat of the spiritual nature, it is indeed the gateway thereto. So now questions F and G in the sequence on page 11 correspond to that second paragraph of Jesus's discourse on religion that I just read. So question F reads as follows: why did Jesus commend the thoughtful contemplation of eternal realities? Please do your best to put such thinking in perspective, so as to compare it with the relative importance of actions and decisions. Is contemplation an end in itself, or are you inclined to believe that its main value lies in stimulating deeper understanding of God's presence and plans, as well as greater willingness to act in harmony with them? Bob, you brought up the end of our previous discussion, and so now I will give you a chance to start this one.
All right, let me just start it then. Throughout the papers, throughout part 4 of the papers, the Midway Commission tells us that Jesus meditated a lot. So this idea about stimulating deeper understanding of God's presence and plans is an important one. In paper 196, it tells us that the great challenge of modern man is to achieve better communication with the divine monitor that dwells within the human mind. I think that's where we are. We've been talking about this communication with the thought adjuster for a couple of webinars now. But this serious contemplation and mental reflection is both an end in itself and a process by which communication with the thought adjuster needs to happen, should happen, and helps us develop this spiritizing thinking. Super thinking, I guess, is what is what the papers call it. So in answer to your question here, we're on F right now, correct?
Yes.
So Jesus commended this thoughtful contemplation because that's what he did. It is in paper 16. It is as the Melchizedek says. It is sad to record that so few Urantians take part in this cosmic thinking. By being able to free up our minds, it's this super thinking that Jesus actually taught. He taught it as as his life. Rodin is a very good example of a human that understood this. And in fact, it's the only human that's described in the papers, and that's what he does call what Jesus did. The importance of this is can't be understated, and I think I'll toss it back to the group to follow up with what I've just started there.
Thank you. Doreen, you have on previous occasions talked about the immediate presence of God that you sensed in various kinds of meditation. And so I would like to adapt this question as to whether that was valuable in itself or because it also provided a contribution to your understanding of God and your understanding of God's plans for us and our ability to cooperate with him, or perhaps, frankly, both sides of it.
Sure. To contemplate eternity realities, certainly, I mean, that is, there's levels. When you contemplate something, you have to be able to interpret what you're getting, what you're seeing, what you're understanding. It's not easy because it's so beyond what we could recognize with our material mind. So, you're saying, yes, it's absolutely necessary. There's no other way to transform ourselves from what we are into where we're going and how we're going to get there. You always throw me the curveball, but it's okay because I could talk about another story that will come to mind. If you don't mind my stories, okay. So
we enjoy your stories, Doreen. Please feel free to go ahead.
Thank you. I mean, it's easier for me to explain some things, what transpires within that deep level of that superconscious mind where you connect with the thought adjuster. And it fires up these neurons and it takes you on a trip. Well, years ago, I had a very traumatic experience. I've only had maybe 3 in my lifetime, but this was one of them. And to say what, if I didn't know God the way I have learned to know and love him and trust him, these decisions would have been absolutely terrible. As a result, I was so taken aback by what happened to me from someone, one of my employees, that it's so hard to say, because it's emotional as well, but But I would have acted in a certain way if it wasn't for the Spirit guiding me. And so I knew I could not go backwards. I have to go forwards, and all the information that I have learned, I have to be true to God to practice what I preach. And therefore, I didn't act. I was frozen. And I took me about a day and a half and praying and asking God, what should I do? And the next day it came. It came. It's like when you don't like your mind, exchange it for the mind of Jesus. Well, that happened to me. I sat down with the person and I didn't know details, but the details came into my mind. It wasn't me because I hadn't had the experience. I was the consequences, the repercussions of terrible actions. And I said the exact right thing. And everything came out perfectly, not knowing that it would. It was, I trusted, I was connected, I asked God to please help me to do the right thing. And because, as I said before, everything affects everybody. So every decision we make in life has repercussions, a ripple effect. And I knew I would be hurting so many people if I took action, that my material mind would say, you know, this is what you have to do. And I didn't. And I was so thankful because everything worked out perfectly, not knowing it would. So to say to you, the contemplation of God, it is the entryway, it's everything. To sit in contemplation and meditation and offer yourself up to God and ask for, you know, the work that needs to be done, because again, I promised, the thought adjusted, that I would do God's will. I promise. And I hope, you know, not to let anyone down. I make a commitment, I stick to it. I'm pretty tough that way. If it kills me, I'll stick to it. Just like this. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Doreen. I have the impression that your thought adjuster has accumulated quite a few promissory notes that you've given,
Yes.
and may indeed call them for action at some point, but you appear entirely ready to honor those promises. So I commend your readiness, and I commend the stories that you always tell us. And Francois, I would like to give you a slight twist to this question, the thoughtful contemplation of eternal realities, and compare that with a certain mental process that did involve contemplation, or at least thought, on the part of persons in the religious tradition, who then took what they were thinking about and turned it into doctrines or creeds that they wanted to impose on others. How do you distinguish the ideas that Jesus is talking about, thoughtful contemplation, from this practice of developing doctrines and creeds and then seeking to impose them on other human beings?
Okay. I think that the contemplation, it must come from the need. So when you need it, you're doing it. So with the creeds and the institutional religion, it's every Sunday at 11 o'clock, and everybody is saying the same thing. You can't do this. It's not this way that is supposed to be. And I think that when you ask what is the contemplation versus the action, it's like studying the breath and human breath, the act of breathing. What's the most important? Is it to exhale or to inhale? Both are important. So you can't have just one. Jesus gave us very, very interesting teachings about that in teachings about prayer and worship, paper 143, section 7. He explained the 2 cycles system. And we don't have that in the institutional religion. They never explain that. They say, so worship, okay, what I'm doing. But Jesus told us that the worship, contemplation of the spiritual must alternate with service, contact with material reality. And he opposed as well, work should alternate with play. Religion should be balanced by humor. Profound philosophy should be relieved by rhythmic poetry. The strain of living, the time tension of personality should be relaxed by the restfulness of worship. The feelings of insecurity arising from the fear of personality isolation in the universe should be antidoted by the faith contemplation of the Father and by the attempted realization of the Supreme. And it's going on, and after it talk about differences and complementarity, prayer and worship, but it's not our subject. But what's interesting that he finished by saying that worship is the act of a part identifying itself with the whole, the finite with the infinite, the finite with the infinite, the Son with the Father, time in the act of striking step with eternity. And it's all so it's a movement, and both are important, and you can just contemplate with nothing at the end, or just act, be in the action, and not having a thought of what you're doing before. And it's like that, but never teach that in the religion of authority. It was time to worship, to pray, and it was very specific, but we should need and have the need to do this to have efficiency.
Thank you. I think if I draw from your comments a basic distinction that you undoubtedly were intending, the difference, at least in part, has to do with individual perceptions from contemplation as opposed to a uniform set of practices that someone else has handed down. Am I correct?
Yes, yes, because the religion of authority tried to make a social part of it, but contemplation, worship, prayer, it's personal, it's individual.
Thank you. Marvin, I would like now, in turning to you, to go back to part of the wording from Jesus and do what Andre called in the webinar preceding this one, the null hypothesis. Jesus says, but what chance does the Father have to appear as a God of supreme loyalties and divine ideals in the souls of men who give little or no time to the thoughtful contemplation of such eternal realities? And so, in effect, does this amount to saying that for people who do not have this practice of thoughtful contemplation, it will be very difficult for them to perceive God in this way, to perceive God in the form of supreme loyalties and divine ideals?
Yeah, I'd like to come back to your question, because I have a number of thoughts in relation to what other folks have shared in relation to this passage.
Good.
The first thing I want to share, and this is a very, very important part of our conversation, I feel. And so I'm going to ask that I want to take a little bit of time to unpack some things that to me are important to understand if we're not to get a little confused about this. First, in the use of the English language in general, and if you compare three venues, right? The Urantia book as a body of information, the culture, right? And how these terms are used in the general culture, And I'm talking about two terms that I want to talk about. One is contemplation or contemplative, and the other is the word worship, right? These terms are used in very different and sometimes confusing ways in the culture, and they're confusing for our personal experience as to what is meant by those terms of contemplation or contemplate and worship. And the Urantia book is very clarifying and gives some very specific ways of describing the use of those terms, but still uses them in multiple ways. So let's take a little bit of a look at that. And frankly, the paradox in terms of how these are used is right in the passages that you shared on page 10. So I'd like to look at that, Neil. And so let me just make a couple of observations. In the larger paragraph in that passage in blue on page 10, Jesus uses the term giving little or no time to the thoughtful contemplation of such eternal realities. That's one of the ways this term contemplation is used in the culture, is that it's a form of thinking, right? It's ruminating, thinking about eternal realities or spiritual realities. It's an intellectual, cognitive process, right?
Well, again, Marvin, before you go on, I would simply give you the benefit of comments that another participant made last week, Stephen Hecht, who said that contemplation is more than just thinking, and it's providing some kind of a link that also involves a higher relationship, perhaps a personal one.
Yeah, I'm going to go there.
All right.
And so the hint as to the other meaning is in the short paragraph right above that in blue, where Jesus says, it is not so important that you should know about the fact of God. Now look at that use of terms, know, which is an intellectual mindful process about the fact of God, right? So intellectual and factual reality, as that you should increasingly grow in the ability to, and they italicize this, feel the presence of God. So the feeling of the presence of God, or the experience of encounter or relationship, is an experience that sits above the level of intellectual function alone.
Good.
Right? It is an experience that is felt or experienced on the personality level. Persons can not only know each other mindily, intellectually, by dialogue, by conversation, but they can love each other by direct relationship and communion, right? So the metaphor for me that's very helpful is the distinction between, if you have a young child and their parent, right? The child and the parent can have a loving conversation. That is a dyadic interaction, right? It involves content, right? They can relate to each other. Also, in addition to that, the child can climb into the parent's lap, and the child and parent can hug each other and hold each other. That is a unitive experience that is beyond interaction or dialogue or intellectual function. It's a direct form of relationship and sharing of love that is a kind of union, right? So the term contemplative and contemplation is used in our culture in these two very different ways. One is to think about something spiritual, and then the term is used to mean contemplative practice, which is a practice of merging with or becoming into union with God. The best term that's used in the Urantia book, the term is used is worship, right? Or communion, right? Which is a form of communication that is beyond intellect. It's a form of union, or it's a unitive experience where I and God become one. We become a shared presence, typical to being embraced or held in love, right? So when the Urantia book describes the term worship, and now here there's another distinction as how the term worship is used in our language. It can either be used to mean corporate worship, which is how Francois was referring to it, right? Groups of people coming together to engage in a liturgy, a worship, right? That's one way the word is used. The other is the way that it's used in the Urantia revelation, and not out in the culture too much, is in this experience of inseparable unitive joining with God, right? Which is not a dialogical function. It's a unitive
personal
function.
relationship.
It's more than a personal relationship, because a personal relationship can have intellectual elements of sharing, and it can have unitive elements of merging with and becoming one with. Two persons merging and joining in a certain sense, which is what is happening with us for worship in the Urantia book sense. So when the Urantia book talks about worship, they say some interesting things. They say the soul craves and initiates worship. Right, this is in the section on true worship in paper 5. It's the last paragraph. They say that they describe what the different parts of us are doing in worship, right? The soul craves and initiates worship. The mind simply consents to worship. The mind is simply saying, yes, I'm going to get out of the way. I'm not going to engage in my primary intellectual dialogical process. I'm going to sit to the side. I'm going to consent to the worship experience. And then they say the thought adjuster conducts the worship, or runs the worship, makes the worship happen, right? So on a bottom line level, the worship experience, in the sense of the Urantia calls it the first duty and the highest privilege of all created intelligences. That sense of worship where we join with God is not something we accomplish or make happen. That is something that God brings about for us and with us. The thought adjuster conducts the worship, right? And Jesus says, and this is a very important passage for me, Jesus says, forget not, it is your personal faith in the exceedingly great and precious promises of God that ensures your becoming partakers of the divine nature. Partakers of the divine nature, where we become divine-like. And then the next sentence says, thus by your faith and the Spirit's transformation, you become in reality the temples of God, and his Spirit actually dwells within you. So this is very important to understand, that in the sense of worship that the Urantia book is describing it as, which is not the corporate worship, it's the individual communion between the son or daughter of God with God. The part that we bring intellectually is to consent, to say yes to this process and give ourselves over to it. And then it is a process where God brings about a transformation in joining with us, which we can't make happen for ourselves. It's a gift, right? And God gives it to us and brings us into this experience of union and joining, and that begins to change us and transform our nature, so that we can begin to partake of the divine nature. So in summary, and this is very, very important, Thomas Keating and other mystics or contemplatives talk about the contemplative process as not a dialogical or intellectual process, but as a process beyond intellect that supersedes intellect, that includes it, but it's a process of joining in an elemental way and becoming one with God, an experience of divine union that God brings about in us. And our part is to consent to it, to say yes to it on a regular basis, so that God can begin that cumulative transformative process. So in summary, these two words, contemplative or contemplation and worship, are used very differently in different contexts. And one sense of contemplative is thinking about things spiritual. The other sense of contemplative is beyond thinking and joining in embrace with God. And then the term worship is used as corporate worship or group worship, which is very different from individual worship as the Urantia book describes it, which is a process of communion that we consent to, that God brings about in us. So pardon me for the lengthy discourse, but unless you understand those distinctions and use them with precision, we get very confused with how those terms are used.
Marvin, I would offer you an additional thought in regard to the word contemplation, or the adjective contemplative. And this correlates with the monastic tradition that we will discuss some time from now, after we finish discussing my essay, Living the Real Religion of Jesus. But it is, again, an establishment of collective traditional matters whereby contemplative meant persons who secluded themselves apart from society and went through rituals of established formal prayers that were essentially compulsory and unoriginal. And that is indeed very different from everything you have said. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
I just to pick up your theme, the term these days that are used by people like Thomas Keating and Richard Rohr, who are writing extensively in this area, the term that they would use to describe what you talked about is not the contemplative tradition. They would use the term the monastic traditions.
Yes.
And over and distinct against, because they're exactly saying that the contemplative practice is a generic practice that anyone can do, lay, clerical, or whatever, and must be done by all people as part of the spiritual life. And it's a much broader generic practice. And the monastic seclusion in society, in cloistered societies, they distinguish between monasticism and contemplative practice, which is for everybody. So I just want to kind of.
Well, you're quite right. I was in effect reaching back predominantly into the historical tradition of monasteries that fostered these fairly stereotyped practices, which you have quite rightly contrasted with the meaning of contemplation and indeed the meaning of worship in the Urantia book. And now I frankly will have to remind you of my question that I started with. Why does Jesus say that without this, there will be little way for a human believer to rise to the level of relationship with these supreme realities?
I'll just say one thing, and then Bob, unless we pay attention to spiritual things, they will not come into operation in our lives. So worship is a form of profound giving ourselves over and attending to God, God's presence, and allowing God to begin to work in us, it's an exercise of faith. We say, I want to be with you, I want to be in your presence, and I want to open to your action within me. So I consent to those realities, and that is worship. I'm sorry to jump in, but Bob.
No, that's fine, but I will indeed add just a postscript to what you have said. The consent, obviously, as a word and as a reality, means a free will decision. That worship, that contemplation, that spiritual growth is not forced on any person, male or female, against his or her will. And so it seems to me that part of what Jesus is saying has to do with encouraging these free will choices.
The fact that it can be coerced is a non sequitur. It
Right.
cannot be coerced. Genuine worship, it has to be exactly what you said. It's a voluntary individual choice.
Thank you. Bob, now you would like to contribute?
Yes, thanks, Neil. Yeah, I started this off with the what, and there's been some great discussion. Really appreciate that. You just asked, what's the why, and that's what's been, I've been kind of waiting to get in the batter's box again here. So let me read the part of the question here, which is a good one, I think, that drives the why out, and I'll explain how I'm going to approach this. So the second half of your question says, is contemplation, because it's been a little while since we read the question, is contemplation an end in itself, or are you inclined to believe that its main value lies in stimulating deeper understanding of God's presence and plans, as well as greater willingness to act in harmony with them? And my answer earlier was yes and yes. So I go back to that same thing that Marvin brought up, is that it's not a paradox here, though. It's just both are true, I think. And how I want to approach this is with something that we talked about, the questions that came earlier. We were talking, we had discussed the difference between morals and ethics. The thought adjuster arrives upon the first moral decision. And I had suggested maybe last week or the week before that a moral decision has to involve another personality in some form or fashion, either directly or indirectly. But where we're progressing is in the ethics, which is more social. When we get to the constellation level, we will run into the ethical sensitizers, which are seraphim. And the mission of these seraphim are to promote and foster the growth of the creature appreciation. Once we are in the grand universe education system, of the morality of interpersonal relationships. For such is the seed and secret of the continued and purposeful growth of society, government, human, or superhuman. So I think of morals and ethics. So, the soul begins to be developed when the thought adjuster comes, of course. We've discussed this at length. Working in our superconscious, developing values that will be eternal, whether we make it or not, whether we survive with the fusion of the adjuster or not, they will become part of the supreme. So those are things that, those are values that are going to be created regardless of whether they remain with our personality when we, if in fact we fuse. We don't meet moral sensitizers anywhere along the way getting to paradise. So what Marvin explained, and that was a great explanation, Marvin, of the process of worship, because that's where it has to get to. It's building these individual moral, personal growth and patterns to be able to become ethical, I think. The difference between these two is the part and the whole again, and that's the paradox that we have to deal with, I think. So my metaphorical picture is just two circles, where the first circle is embedded in the larger circle. When we start out, we make that first moral decision. We have a very small circle where the outside circle, which is the ethical part, it is not built yet. Now, Steve brought up, and I agreed with him, because I had been thinking about this, that when we make that first moral decision, presently we will find God in the souls of others. And Steve had felt that it was very close in time lag. And I tended to agree because, as I said a couple of weeks ago, was that it almost appeared as though that, well, if a child is spending all that time with father and or mother, they're feeling this personality connection, because personalities will understand personalities. When that moral decision occurs, has it been the result of, or is it the growth toward and making that? I will leave that as a question for now. But I think that when Jesus used the word presently, he means soon. Soon we're going to discover the soul. And then we discover the soul's, the presence of God in those that do not have the factual presence of God, as we mentioned earlier, like the Univitatia, that we have to understand and grow in understanding what the presence of God is in those that do not have the factual presence of God, as we humans on Urantia at least do. So to move outside of this ethical circle is, I think, part and parcel with our cosmic growth, truth, beauty, and goodness, etc. And we have to understand the presence of God as we're worshiping and making that connection, as Marvin talked, with the unity of the Father, to be able to expand out. Again, into total reality. We started with talking about the Trinity. So this why question, going back to why, I think is for the growth, the progressive growth of our society, of our government, of our civilization, human or superhuman. No matter where we're going to go, we're going to have to be able to increase our socialization maturity to be able to understand the ethics of morality, which is at the social level. Back over to you.
Thank you. I will now turn to my own assigned role as the moderator of this discussion, and will proceed to make a decision.
By the way, Doreen had her hand up. I don't know if you saw that, Neil.
I did not see it. Doreen, would you like to comment at this point before I make my moral decision?
Oh, I'm sorry. there were so many things I wanted to say, but words, when you're worshiping God, it's not with words. Contemplating God, I use words. I'm contemplating, I could walk in the woods, I could, bring the association of mind, my material mind with God, and that presence in the surroundings, and it's very beautiful. But when you're worshiping God, there's no time, no space, nothing exists that is familiar to us. You are enveloped into something that is just beyond what we could identify. I have no idea where it is, but it's habit forming, and there's that spiritual pull that you need to be there. And if you make it, as often as you can, it does transform you. It transforms your decisions, your actions, everything in your life becomes more real, and the rest of it is insignificant. And you recognize really how you're working within the Supreme, how those actions and decisions and morals and ethics and all this stuff, it all falls into place. You're no longer that person you were. And it really is such a gift. It's so extraordinary. But a lot was said, and I don't want to prolong it anymore, but I'll turn it over to you, Neil. Thank you.
Thank you. I was starting to comment that in my exercise of my role as the moderator, I will now decide to move on to question G in the box. And I would suggest to you that this decision of mine is a moral decision, because I think it relates to my relationship with each of you as human beings. But I believe it is also an ethical decision, because I have a responsibility for our social gathering. And from a perspective of moving along our social gathering in this framework, it is now time for us to proceed to question G. So we will do that.
Touché. Wonderful.
Here we go. It is as follows. Question G. Please analyze and interpret Jesus's concluding sentence. While the mind is not the seat of the spiritual nature, it is indeed the gateway thereto. Now, before I yield to all of you for your extremely interesting answers that I'm expecting, I would point out that we have an interesting paradox, or perhaps even an unusual idea here, because Jesus repeatedly contrasts the religion of the mind with the religion of the spirit. We know that human beings live in finite reality composed of mind, matter, and spirit. We previously discussed that mind is the vehicle that lets us communicate with matter, and it is also the vehicle that lets us communicate with spirit. But mind can be abused as a vehicle for enforcing uniformity in spiritual matters on the basis of authority. So we have a surprising idea here, at least somewhat surprising. In this sentence, Jesus is commending the role of the mind. So I wonder how you deal with all of that, Francois.
Yes, Neil, because the mind is not the seat of the spiritual nature, but the soul is. But to connect, our soul need our mind to connect with God when we are here, not later, but here it's the fact. And so I connect with what said Marvin. All you have to do is consent. You want to point that the seat of the spiritual nature is the soul, but you have to put your mind in a favorable state, okay, to open. So keep quiet, stop the hamster, and make silence. It's just a consent. So it's consent. And if you consent, because it's true that the soul craves for the contact with the thought adjuster, but it can be so the mind must open and make favorable state. It's all we have to do. And Jesus said it's a gateway there too. It's a gate. So when you open the gate, you don't have to go outward and seek for God. No, you just have to open the gate and He's coming. He does the job. So it's my interpretation of this sentence.
So if I understand you correctly, you are looking at this as a question of the mind giving consent, making an active decision, and then the spirit flows. Is that basically
yes,
part of the idea? Yes. Okay, well, now I have an ethical dimension that I'm going to address by recognizing Marvin in just a second. But I have to point out the dilemma that I face, because my experience as an ethical matter, ethics being related to our social gathering, is that if I recognize Marvin early in the discussion, he will then listen to what other people are saying and will appeal to me at the very end to pile in again. So in this case, I will indeed recognize Marvin here at an early phase of our discussion of this question.
Well, I want to salute you, Neil, as an astute observer of human nature. So the sentence that you're pointing us to is this one: while the mind is not the seat of the spiritual nature, it is indeed the gateway thereto. So we're speaking here of mind or intellectual function as a preceding function, as an entryway function to a state of worship or encounter that is beyond mind function. And interestingly enough, the Urantia book, in its distinction between the nature of prayer and worship, as it uses those terms, and the relationship of prayer leading into worship, it provides wonderful clarification on this issue. Prayer is an intellectually mediated interaction, using language, as Doreen mentioned, talking to God, right? Using our minds. Worship is, and when we transition into worship, we transition into a state that is beyond language and beyond mind function, that envelops the entire personality in God's love and God's presence. And it is a unitive experience that is beyond concept or thought. And it may have correlatives or trickle down that have intellectual results, but the experience itself is above the level of thinking. And Jesus, in this passage that I'd like to share with you guys, which is a great passage, 146:17, he says this. Jesus, well, actually, the midwives say this. Jesus taught his followers that when they had made their prayers to the Father, they should remain for a time in silent receptivity, to afford the indwelling spirit the better opportunity to speak to the listening soul. The Spirit of the Father speaks best to men when the human mind is in an attitude of true worship. In other words, an attitude of receptivity, right? Not spinning our thoughts or talking, but of resting in God's presence and opening to God's action and allowing God to make clear to us what God wants to, right? And then they go on to say, we worship God by the aid of the Father's indwelling spirit. In other words, the adjuster conducts the worship, and by the illumination of the human mind through the ministry of truth, right? So in the midst of the worship experience, Jesus' Spirit of truth is ministering to us as we sit in this listening or receptive state and wait for God to bring about these transformative experiences in us. And then he goes on to say, worship, taught Jesus, makes one increasingly like the being who was worshiped. Worship is a transforming experience whereby the finite gradually approaches and ultimately attains the presence of the infinite. So really, there isn't a mystery here. And again, it's not either or, it's both and. In the prayer, there's a continuum between prayer and worship, and there's a transition. And in the prayer part of it, it's more dialogical, using language and interactive, and more transcendent. In other words, me and God as separate beings interacting. And in worship, it's more immanent, and me and God joining, me resting in God, and God being about a transformative process in that state of union that is fundamentally mysterious. We don't understand the process that God is engaging in. We experience the fruits of it in our lives. We see the changes, we feel the changes, as Doreen so beautifully expressed, but we don't see the mechanism because it's above our conscious awareness. It's God's function in us beyond intellect. And Jesus said, when you finished your prayer, go rest in worship and allow your listening soul to receive the benefits of God's transformative presence in a worshipful state. So to me, it's very clear, and it is a both and experience in different parts of the experience.
Thank you, Marvin. I will now turn to Bob, and simply for convenience, I will reread the question, which is quite short. Please analyze and interpret Jesus's concluding sentence. While the mind is not the seat of the spiritual nature, it is indeed the gateway thereto. Bob?
Thanks, Neil. I'd like to pick up on what Francois said. It's like a bridge. Fairly, and it's not a mystery, as Marvin said, fairly clear here. I'm going to just go back again to the thoughts about mind itself. We're taught that there's 3 levels of mind. Most psychology, I suppose, or the current conventional thinking is that there's a subconscious and a conscious. The subconscious, of course, that works autonomically, and the conscious, which is our seat of our decisions. But the superconscious is what we're dealing with in this particular situation here. While it's not the seat of our spiritual nature, it's the beginning of the seat of our spiritual nature, because that's where our soul is being woven, which is the metaphor that the solitary messenger uses to explain what the thought adjuster is doing. And in fact, the soul is the relationship between the thought adjuster and the mind as the mind grows. So we're crossing the bridge, so to speak, trying to move into this superconscious level, which is truly a Morantia level. There's a very interesting statement that I've thought about for a long time, and it comes in the middle of paper 111, section 3, paragraph 2. Paper 111 is discusses the adjuster and the soul. And I just like to get to the middle one. Let me read both sentences here, if you'll indulge me in this. It says, during the life in the flesh, the evolving soul is enabled to reinforce the supermaterial decisions of the mortal mind. So we're making our decisions in the mind arena of choice. Our personality has free will, and it operates in our conscious area of our decisions. The soul, being supermaterial, it is Morantia, does not of itself function on the material level of human experience, okay? Neither can this sub-spiritual soul, without the collaboration of some spirit of deity, such as the adjuster, function above the Morantia level. Now here's the sentence that I've thought about for many years. Neither does the soul make final decisions until death or translation divorces it from material association with the mortal mind, except when and as this material mind delegates such authority freely and willingly to such a Morantia soul of associated function. Well, very much like Marvin so eloquently discussed, that we consent to worship, we step aside. In fact, our mortal mind can make such decisions as to delegate the authority to this Morantia soul. During life, the mortal will, the personality power of decision choice, is resident in the material mind circuits in our conscious area. As terrestrial mortal growth proceeds, this self, with its priceless powers of choice, becomes increasingly identified with the emerging Morantia soul entity. We're crossing over the bridge in our progression, and we'll see this in our cosmic circle progression as we understand matter, mind, and spirit as a unity, as a cosmic unity. We're moving across that bridge, moving into the gateway that Jesus speaks about. After death and following the mansion world resurrection, the human personality is completely identified with the Morantia self. The soul is thus the embryo of the future Morantia vehicle. This gateway is absolutely essential to understand, contemplate about, and at some point, if we really understand that middle sentence, we can delegate our current mind, conscious mind, can delegate that authority to our superconscious Morantia soul. But I don't believe we can do that until we spend more time worshiping, understanding how Marvin explained how we worship. It's all in the it's in the mind, and we need to progress. So here's the last thought. We've got to progress and understand how to progress across that bridge, as Francois talked about, because if we don't, then we go back to the religion of the mind, and we circumscribe ourselves in our conscious mind, and we just run around in a circle like a rat or a gerbil. Sorry, like a gerbil. Back over to you.
Well, I would simply comment that we are not gerbils and we are not running around in circles, but I appreciate your comparison. Doreen, in looking at this question, I'm reminded of comments that you've made from time to time, that your experience of contemplation or meditation in some cases led you to insights and ideas or ideals or spiritual realities that sometimes you were able to explain in your normal mind after you had ceased this experience, but sometimes not, and then you couldn't quite put your finger on this. So in effect, I'm asking you to comment, if you will, on the relationship between the higher levels of contemplation and the normal levels of the mortal mind.
Okay, the normal levels. Well, Bob took the words, everything I was going to say. He said, that's so funny. But anyway, because the mind doesn't create real values, it says, you can't without the thought adjuster. I mean, this is my relationship. It's truly a relationship. It's my best friend. The thought adjuster is everything, controller, whatever, leader. So gosh, I'm always all over the place. You try to align that creature domain with the spiritual, and it's to cultivate this relationship. And it's an infinite, it's to infinity. And how do you understand God's wisdom unless you enter into going through, of course, the seven, I'm getting myself all the adjective mind spirits. So to say I remember, okay, I could see things and I could hear things, but for the most part, honestly, I'm in a classroom. They're talking to me. I don't know who it is. Maybe it's just the thought adjuster. I just don't know. I know I'm being taught. I absolutely, in that domain, they're talking to my higher consciousness, the superconscious mind. But when I'm there, I understand. When I come out of this process of the situation, I come down or out, of the depth of where I connected, I can't remember a thing. It fades as if it never existed, but I know it took place. That's all I know. There are other things that the spirit reveals, and there's different ways for everyone. So I'm not saying it's the only way, but if I went into that higher state, I could see them. I could see, like you're looking at a computer and you're downloading your email, And it comes like that in gigantic sequences, just dropping into my mind, all kinds of writings, and I could see words. But again, and sometimes, I say, stop, slow it down. I want to read what you're sending me, so there is a connection on that level. But again, I come out of it, nothing. I cannot remember not one thing. So I always think of everything has to be earned. You have to experience things. You cannot, there's no free lunch. God is not going to give you, anything that you haven't discovered, because that's what your mind has to do. Recognize, interpret, discover, and choose. So in those cases, I put together this whole, trying to understand how the thought adjuster works as each individual, with how you get through to them. I'm not an intellectual. I told you, it works differently with me. I learn through the experiences. When I experience, it transforms my mind. It uplifts me. It makes me a better person. It opens up a vision of a beautiful reality that the rest of the stuff kind of, I don't get excited about anymore. People try to become negative and they want to challenge everything. I couldn't care less. I see, treat people kindly, learn to love. God is love. This connection is full of love. It is deep, and it's just so encouraging to help you to live life. And it's so beautiful. So why would I ever engage in anything that is not of the highest level, that would uplift and help to build my soul and move me on, for that eternal adventure that we're all working towards, that perfection. And I know that I don't have to think about it. We had a discussion at a society meeting a few weeks ago. And I asked the question, do I think that, oh, I should do this because then, it'll put the plus column that I'll be in God's favor. It doesn't work that way. It so automatically becomes part of who you are. You don't have to think. It's an action. You act, you decide, you act. It repercusses in the universe, wherever, and the consequences, of course, is God's. It doesn't matter. But that's how I'm not sure, if I very succinct in asking your question, and answering you, Neil, because I write all the intellectual stuff and you give me something personal, which I thank you for. You're really kind to me. Let the guys answer. Their minds are so prone towards understanding such depth.
Well, Doreen, thank you. And please allow me to compliment you on these beautiful insights that you've shared with us. Let me offer you my, I suppose, intellectual conclusion from some of what you have said. You have said that you sense during this process that truths, that realities are being revealed to you, or being expressed to you. And that on the other hand, sometimes you cannot quite put your finger later in your conscious mind on what has happened. Now, the offer of explanation that I will give you now is my own conclusion, and you can certainly take issue with it. In effect, what it seems to me is that you're describing a process of new spiritual realities that are being combined together and provided to your soul, and that they are resources that you will draw on, perhaps without even knowing that they're there, in a very conscious way. How do you think about that? Does that seem reasonable?
I agree. I agree to some extent, definitely, because otherwise I would be aware of it. Maybe other people can, but I know it's taking place, that's all. And when I see things, and that's on another level. And sometimes that is difficult until you actually have the experience, then the aha, that's what they showed me. Because you don't know. How do you know until you know? So that's it. They're so interesting, and there is no limitation. It's just the effort that you put in to really want to choose God, to work as one not separate. I don't see myself separate from the thought adjustment, the spirit. We are united as far as I can. And it's more than just, mind, because again, it's a power, a spiritual power and a force, and it resonates on many levels. But it's, you also have intuition and things, but it's really, really what you said is, I would say, right on to some extent. Yeah, you've got it. Thank you.
So even though the words do not quite come through in the outer mind,
Right.
still these spiritual resources are part of your soul. And I would suspect, I would submit that you are able to draw on these spiritual resources, even though the words do not quite come. Am I correct?
Yeah, because I'm a
Approximately
happier
correct.
person as a result of it. I am truly a happier person. As I grew up with all negativity surrounding me, I totally transformed that. It doesn't have any influence over me, and my fears are getting less. I can't say I'm devoid of all of them, not quite, but much better than I ever was.
Well, thank you again. I believe, did my prediction about Marvin turn out to be true, that he would call attention again at the end of our discussion? Did you put your hand up, or was that just a motion, Marvin?
I did. I just want to again remark on your capacity for prophecy here, Neil, is astounding. Just a couple of things. One in relation to what Doreen just shared, and then a thought in relation to what Bob shared. One of the things that Thomas Keating describes in this contemplative process, the process of ongoing worship, he says that when we enter into that state, when we're in a worshipful state, 99% of what's going on is what God is doing, and 1% is what we're doing. What we're doing was we're simply bringing the desire to be in worship, to be in God's presence. And we're saying to God, do your thing in me, your will be done. And what happens, he says, is that what God is doing in the midst of that contemplative experience is above the level of our conscious experience. We're only vaguely aware that there's lots of activity going on. And that what he says is, you won't know it by the actual experience itself that it's going on, but what you will see if you are engaged regularly in worshipful communion, and I know, Doreen, you've experienced this a lot, is in the rest of your day and your days, you will experience the fruits of that contemplative experience showing up here and there and everywhere, and you don't really understand the mechanism of how God brings it about in your life. But what I've experienced, I know you've experienced this, Doreen, is when you're engaged in that practice, those fruits are just showing up left, right, and center all the time. And if you lapse and you don't engage in that communion experience, they slowly atrophy and disappear, right? And I've had people describe this to me. So I think that's exactly it. We don't understand the mechanism. It's a gift. It's just a total gift that God gives to us. And it's mystery how he gives it to us. But that he gives it to us, and in wonderful ways all the time when we engage in communion with him, that's undeniable.
Thank you, Marvin. I will
Yeah,
compliment you. Are you still inclined to add? I'm sorry.
Yeah, just one thought in relation to what Bob shared, and it's much simpler. And I've thought about that same section that you mentioned, Bob, in the section on the growth of the soul, and the phrasing is, when the material mind delegates such authority freely and willingly to such a Morancha soul of associated function, which is very interesting stuff. And I just wanted to connect it up with what we were talking about earlier, that when in worship, the mind, the soul craves and initiates worship. In other words, the soul desires it, but the mind has the power of choice, what we're going to do and pay attention to, right? And when the mind consents to worship, the soul says, I want to do this, right? I want to worship God, worship my source. And the mind says, okay, I could do any number of other things, but I'm going to delegate my authority to choose to you, and I'm going to bow to your desire, and we're going to worship now. The mind consents, right? That is, and whenever we do that, we are doing what you found in that passage. We are saying, our minds are saying, I'm going to yield to my soul's desire and allow the soul to manifest my will in that decision. So I think every time we worship, we're engaged in that delegation of authority.
Marvin, I have to compliment you on your choice of menu. That you've offered us many fruits, whereas my colleague Bob, was giving us gerbils. I must say I like fruits better than gerbils. So in any event, we will proceed on now to the next section. I would say that as a general matter, we have had an extremely interesting discussion of the presence of God, the section of this paper that has occupied us for several weeks. And now we will turn just briefly to the beginning of a new section called The Mission and the Timeline. And this starts near the bottom of page 11. I will proceed to read the introductory paragraph that initiates the consideration of this question. The mission and the timeline. Shortly before Christ Michael left Salvington in order to begin serving as the Paradise Son, who would bestow himself on Urantia in the human form of Jesus of Nazareth, his older brother, Emmanuel of Salvington, the Union of Days, the ambassador of the Paradise Trinity to the local universe of Nebadon, gave Michael detailed instructions on behalf of the Universal Father. Although these instructions extend throughout sections 1, 2, and 3 of paper 120, in other words, from page 1325 to page 1330 of the single column edition, we shall concentrate on the following 3 paragraphs from section 3, which is entitled Further Counsel and Advice. Bob, would you read that paragraph at the bottom of the page, just the paragraph that begins with the number 3, please?
Sure. Number 3, in your relations to the social order, we advise that you confine your efforts largely to spiritual regeneration and intellectual emancipation. Avoid all entanglements with the economic structure and the political commitments of your day. More especially, devote yourself to living the ideal religious life on Urantia.
Thank you. We are going to discuss this very briefly, but certainly resume when we have our next phase of discussion in these webinars. I would point out in a fundamental sense that we have to bear in mind that Emmanuel is giving Michael these instructions, as it says in the paragraph, on behalf of the Universal Father. Further, we know that Michael's bestowal on Urantia was a bestowal that he lived through in subordination to and as a demonstration of the will of the Father. So with these factors in mind, I will now ask Francois, why was Michael instructed to avoid all entanglements with the economic structure and the political commitments of his day? You have muted yourself, Francois, so.
Okay, and to say, to answer your question, it's because it's too typical of one time, of one set of times. So if he got entanglements with economic structure and political commitments, will have problem. Half of the people will be against him, and it's not the matter. He was there to talk about eternal matters. So from epochal to epochal, it will change. So it's not the place to, and people tried to induce him to do that. he had to resist all of his life, resist about death.
Thank you. And I agree with the importance of his emphasis on spiritual matters, which is certainly related to the subsequent paragraph that we will consider next week. But it's by implication a contrast with the premises of epical revelation that were followed in the original dispensation of the planetary prince Caligastia, who ultimately rebelled, and that were followed in the original regime of Adam and Eve in the garden. So Emmanuel is telling Michael that in his bestowal on Urantia, he will follow a different approach. Marvin, would you comment on the difference?
Yeah, Neil. So just to recap, the passage we read, Emmanuel is saying to Jesus, confine your efforts largely to the spiritual regeneration and intellectual emancipation. Avoid all entanglements with the economic structure and political commitments of your day. And I want to add a passage here, which for me is clarifying in regard to, because the question you're raising has implications for our work with this revelation. Do we engage in primarily in our ministry efforts, and service efforts? Do we engage primarily in a spiritual mission of spiritual uplift and teaching? Or do we also engage in service efforts in political realm, economic realms, social realms, other Reformation realms that the earlier revelations, the first and second revelation, focused on as well, societal transformation? That's the question I think you're posing for us as we go along here, Neil.
Well, we're understanding what Emmanuel told Michael, but we're also comparing it with our situation as the recipients of the fifth epical revelation.
Exactly. And so here's a passage that for me is very clarifying on exactly this question. And it's a bifold question. One is, what was Emmanuel saying to Jesus? And what are the implications for us with this fifth epical revelation, which has elements related to politics and economics and society in general, in contrast to what Emmanuel was saying to Jesus. But look at what the revelators say in this passage. And this to me is very clarifying in regard to this apparent dilemma. And I don't think it's an actual dilemma. I think it's simply apparent in some readings. So here's the passage. It's 195.9.4. And they're speaking now present tense to us, right? With this revelation. Religion does need new leaders, spiritual men and women who will dare to depend solely on Jesus and his incomparable teachings. So there's essentially a spiritual mission. If Christianity persists in neglecting its spiritual mission while it continues to busy itself with social and material problems, right? The societal and material problems, the spiritual renaissance must await the coming of these new teachers of Jesus' religion, who will be exclusively devoted to the spiritual regeneration of men and women. But look at this next sentence. They're describing a two-part sequence, right? First, the spiritual teaching and regeneration of humanity. And then they have this follow-up sentence, and they say, and then will these spirit-born souls, meaning the recipients of that spiritual ministry, quickly supply the leadership and inspiration requisite for the social, moral, economic, and political reorganization of the world. Now, this is in paper 195, which is essentially predictive of what must come as a result of this revelation. That's the context they're speaking of. They're not speaking of the time of Jesus and Emmanuel's instruction. They're saying now what must happen is this. So this is not, it's another case of this is not either or. It's not either we do only spiritual work or we do political, economic, social uplift, societal transformation. What they're saying is that there is a sequence here. First, the first and most high priority goal that you must have with this revelation is the spiritual uplift and transformation of human culture and civilization, and the spiritual uplift of the lives of human beings. Once you've addressed yourself to that, and you can do it in parallel, but the primacy is with the spiritual mission. Because what they're saying is the people who are thus spiritually transformed by that initial ministry will, in their own sense of calling, go out into the different realms of civilization and uplift the politics, the social involvement, the political and financial structures of society, etc., the educational institutions, etc., right? All of those will be uplifted by those spiritually transformed individuals who initially are benefited by the spiritual outreach that must flow from this new revelation. So that to me is very critical. It's not an either or conflictual question. It's a matter of sequence and relationship between the spiritual efforts and the societal transformative efforts that will eventually flow from those fruits.
Marvin, you have certainly provided a very cogent explanation of that paragraph. I would say to you that in addition, however, the authors of the Urantia book, in specific terms, the Chief of Seraphim, who wrote paper 114, described the current efforts of the Master Seraphim, which are not limited by the sequence you portrayed. And the Master Seraphim are working on renewing the elements of civilization that you have largely described, broader elements too, but they certainly overlap with what you have said. So we have a process of simultaneity, but also a process of leadership, and I respect your point. I think what I would like to do now, with thanks to you and to all of our other participants, is to state that we will continue to discuss this paragraph 3 and the ones that follow, paragraphs 4 and 5, from Emmanuel's instructions to Michael of Salvington before he left on his mission to Urantia. When we resume after a break, this is the final webinar in phase 6. Bob and I have tentatively decided that we will resume on the 11th of April, but that is subject to possible further changes. We believe we will resume on the 11th of April. But this has been an extremely interesting discussion today. In this case, I have recognized Marvin at the beginning, and he doesn't have a chance to come back at the end, because the end will not occur until the 11th of April. At least he may have a chance to come back at the end of that. We will reserve that possibility for further consideration. But once again, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your many interesting contributions today throughout our discussion of our earlier subtopic, the presence of God, and throughout the entire 6 webinars that constituted phase 6. We will start phase 7 on the 11th of April or on some other day that we choose later. Once again, thank you very much.
Thank you very
Thanks,
much.
everyone.
Have a wonderful break.
Thank
All
you,
right,
everybody.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you, Neil.
Nice weekend. Bye-bye.
I know.
Love you guys.